Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is wonderful to welcome everyone here on our Zoom call tonight with our very distinguished scholar, who I'll introduce in one moment. But I see many of you have gathered tonight to hear this very important topic because I think there's a lot of confusion amongst Jews as to the status of Jesus. We know that he was born Jewish, but we wonder often, how did this Jewish boy become the father of the largest religion today? And how is it that so much anti-Semitism and persecution of Jews was carried out in his name or in defense of him? And when we think about Jewish-Christian relationships over the millenniums, over the centuries, and we think about his influence and what he brought to Christianity and what was his personal status in terms of his own observance of Judaism, and how the religion was founded as a result of his life, and how is it that he strayed from his Jewish heritage and roots. All of this is a fascinating subject that many of us are very curious and interested in learning more about, especially this week, as there's a lot of focus on him. And we have no greater speaker and historian than our guest speaker tonight to shed light and clarity on the origins of Christianity and the person Jesus and his Jewish roots, and how it is that he strayed from Judaism, and what is our feelings towards him and towards the religion that was founded in his name. And how do we deal with anti-Semitism, which is often leveled against the Jewish community as a result of being accused of being, as they call it, Christ killers. So for tonight's discussion, which will last between 30 and 40 minutes, followed by Q&A. So if you have questions, feel free to type it into the chat box and we will present it to our scholar afterwards. But tonight we have with us one of the leading Orthodox and Jewish historians, Dr. Henry Abramson. Dr. Henry Abramson is the Dean of Touro Lando College of Arts and Sciences in New York. He has a PhD in history from the University of Toronto. He has also had many postdoctoral visiting appointments at Harvard, Cornell, Oxford, Hebrew University. He is also the author of 6 best-selling books, and he's an internationally renowned scholar and lecturer to audiences literally around the world. And we are delighted tonight to have him for ourselves to learn so much about this topic. I just want to mention that our very own executive director, Sarah Dworkin, studied under his tutelage at Touro, Miami, and was a student of Dr. Abramson. And so we feel a very warm connection to him, and it's an honor and a pleasure to introduce our scholar in residence tonight, Dr. Henry Abramson, on the topic of Jesus and his Jewish Mishpacha.
Thank you very much, Rabbi. It's very kind of you. I'm glad we're recording this because my mother doesn't have Zoom, but I'd like to play it back for her. I think she would enjoy that so much. And I am especially pleased to be speaking to your Kehillah because, of course, Ms. Dworkin was one of our star students in Miami, and it's great to maintain the connection. So you've given actually the description of my topic is a little broader than I thought we would get to. I mean, explaining anti-Semitism and things like that is a little longer than 30 minutes, maybe 40 minutes we could stretch it, but it's a huge topic. I have a more modest kind of ambition, and I'm hoping that we will still find there's lots of useful material for thought. Specifically, I want to look at the biography of Jesus specifically, try to place him within his historical context in the land of Israel in the first century, and try to understand how to interpret what we have of his teachings and how do they fit into the broader spectrum of Jewish thought. I think we will see some interesting parallels to our own time there. Then I'd like to look a little bit more specifically at the end of his life and try to tease out some of the very confusing and quite noxious attitudes that have developed around it, as you have correctly indicated. And then just spend a little bit of time pushing the time frame forward up until about the year 100 to look at the activity of one of his most important disciples, although he never met him in real life, Paul, and try to understand how this movement, which was essentially following one Jewish young man around the northern part of Israel in particular suddenly not only became viral, nuclear, and got huge, but at the same time, how it diverged so dramatically and so painfully from the mother religion. So with that more modest kind of sensibility, let's get started. I've got 3 short lectures that I'm going to present in sequence. Depending on how they go, perhaps I can take some questions in the middle of them, but otherwise we'll go right to the end, and then we'll have time to discuss afterwards. Let me just share my screen for the first of them. And here we go. Can everybody see? It says Judea in the time of Jesus there. Someone nod so I can tell. Yeah, okay, great. So let's first understand his historical setting. The picture here is a famous 17th century painting by Mattia Preti, Pilate washing his hands. Pilate was the Roman procurator at the time of Jesus's death. And in the context of crucifying him, he wanted to have nothing more to do with it. So he famously asked to wash his hands. And that's where we get the expression in English, to wash your hands of something, meaning to like, I don't want to be involved in this anymore. It comes actually from this particular passage in the Gospels. Okay, so here we go. The context of his early life is in the dynasty of King Herod. This is Herod the Great. There are several other kings also named Herod who are his children. He died in the year 4 before the Common Era, which right away, by the way, sets up a problem in the chronology, because there's a passage in the Gospels, that's the Christian scriptures, that talks about Herod trying to kill all the baby boys, sort of like Pharaoh tried to kill all the baby boys to avoid Moses, but that would mean that Jesus's birthday is already off. He was not born, so to speak, in the year 0. If the story of the massacre of the innocents is correct, he would have been born in the year 4, or perhaps even a little bit earlier than that. At any rate, Herod dies in the year 4, and the Romans decide not to appoint, at least for now, a king in charge of Israel. They've had enough with kings. Herod himself was a really brutal, awful king in many ways, murdered many of his own family, his own children, actually went insane towards the end of his life. So they decide to appoint an ethnarch instead. An ethnarch is a Greek and Latin term meaning leader of a people, but it's just a kind of a paper title. It doesn't actually mean much. The Romans are really in charge. They give the main area of Judea, which is in the kind of darker blue there, to his son Archelaus, who proves to be just as cruel as his father. They give 2 other areas, the Perea, which would be on the east bank of the Jordan River today, and the Galilee region in the north, to his younger brother Herod Antipas. And they give this region, which was part of Israel at the time, to another brother, Herod Philip. That's out in what would be Syria and northern Jordan. And to a sister, Salome, they give the region of Yamnia, which is Yavne in modern Hebrew, and a little space on the Jordan River. Now, Archelaus, the ruler, turns out to be pretty cruel, just like his father. So the Romans say, that's it, we're getting rid of him. They exile him to Vienne, which is on the Rhone River in the south of France. Not too bad being exiled to the Rhone River in the south of France, but at the time there was hardly any Jews there, absolutely no kosher Chinese at all, so it was really a drag for him. And they replaced him with a Roman administrator called a prefect and later a procurator. The procurators are really the people in charge. That will be important, especially when we get to the death of Jesus. 2 of them are especially important. The one is Pontius Pilate, who I showed you at the first screen, who was alive and responsible for the death of Jesus. Another, Gessius Florus, was an incredibly cruel administrator who was largely responsible for the Roman-Jewish war that ultimately resulted in the destruction of the temple. There was actually a titular king later, 2 of them actually. The first was named Herod Agrippa I, and the rabbi is probably familiar with a few passages that refer to him in the Talmud, he actually shows up every now and then as kind of like being interested in Jewish things and wanting to support the Jews, but he was poisoned in the year 44. His son takes over, that's Agrippa II, who is shown here in this rather remarkable piece of art from Vasily Surikov. Agrippa II shows up in the Christian scriptures, not in an especially good light, because at one passage he wants to interview Paul, who we'll talk about within the next half hour or so. And he actually shows some interest in Christianity. In this particular painting, I kind of like it because you can see that there's Agrippa II on the left. He looks like your kind of traditional view of a Middle Eastern potentate. There's Porcius Festus, who was the procurator between the years 60 and 62. And then Agrippa II's sister, Berenice. I like the name Porcius Festus, but it's interesting that he doesn't look either porky nor festive, so it doesn't seem to fit him very well. At any rate, that's how the kings are just puppet kings that really don't make much difference in terms of who's in charge in Israel at the time. Really, what's important are the prefects and the procurators, and they are horrible. They are corrupt. They're into the grift. They're taking bribes. We should realize that Israel was not completely Jewish at this time, and in fact, at no time in Jewish history was the land of Israel, completely Jewish in population. And the prefects and the procurators often take advantage of the ethnic splits in the land to favor the Syrian Greeks living there, or the Samaritans, or the Phoenicians, various different peoples. And in some cases, this results in violence. One of those events happened after a revolt in the year 40, when the Emperor Caligula, when he heard that the Jews refused to offer sacrifices to the emperor, which is something that every other people in the Roman Empire did. It was just part of being polite that on the emperor's birthday, you would sacrifice a pig in his honor. It was because they viewed themselves as literally as gods. And so, and not doing so would have been the ancient equivalent of, for example, refusing to stand during the national anthem at a ball game. So Caligula was so upset with them that he ordered a statue of himself be placed directly in the temple in Jerusalem. And it was only because his underlings knew that the Jews would certainly revolt if he were to do something like that. They revolted after all during the Maccabean period, and it would be no different if he tried to do it in the year 40. So they slow walked it, hoping he would change his mind. Ultimately, what ended up happening, however, he was killed, and so that particular danger was averted for the short period of time. However, the procurators constantly maintained a very heavy presence in Israel, often to the detriment of the Jews. And the base of their activity was not in Jerusalem. It was in a town called Caesarea, or Caesarea, which is on the coast, roughly halfway between what would be today Tel Aviv and Haifa. This was kind of like a Roman island. There was a Jewish minority living in that city, but it was basically kind of like a big suburb of Rome, with gymnasium and with athletic games and with lots of idolatrous activities, theater, things like that. Here's, by the way, just one other interesting archaeological find. This is a stone that actually has Pilate's name on it. You can see where the arrow points to Pilatus. I think later on in life, he invented a very popular exercise program. That's a joke. I can't hear you laughing on Zoom, but I'm having a good time anyways. Now, what's important for placing us within the ideological construct of Jesus' life is we should understand that the first year, the first century of that millennium was one of tremendous Messianic ferment. Jews in particular really believed that Mashiach was it was almost time for the Messiah to come. And of course, the Messiah in Jewish thought means a human redeemer who will act in a political vein, that will be a military leader, that will establish independence for the Jewish people in the land of Israel, that will defend them from all their enemies about, and then will bring about slowly other aspects of an apocalyptic future, the end of world hunger, and all kinds of things like that. So there are lots of groups who are running around who are participating in this Messianic ferment. It's not at all surprising to see Jesus in this context, but there are lots of others who weren't successful. For example, Josephus, who was a very important historian for us, a word about him in a minute, refers to a particular Egyptian prophet. And he means by this, by the way, a Jewish man who happened to come from Egypt, who actually assembled an army and ordered everyone to meet him on the Mount of Olives. And he was going to march on Jerusalem and take it over and initiate the Messianic period. And what ended up happening is, of course, the Romans heard about his announcement. They met him and all of his erstwhile followers, and they massacred them right there on Har Hazezim. So just to give you a sense of the feel of it. We also have a large population of people who radically separated from the body politic, and they moved to live in a very forbidding desert area called Khirbat Qumran, which is just to the east, to the west of the Dead Sea. And in fact, they left behind a lot of their writings, which were discovered in 1947, the Dead Sea Scrolls, where they described how they believed that it was just about the time for Mashiach, and they were getting ready, they were preparing themselves. They were wearing all white every day and maintaining all kinds of interesting practices. This is the kind of environment in which Jesus grew up. Now, I would like to look at one specific thing about Josephus, who I mentioned earlier. Just a word about who Josephus was, because he's incredibly important for studying the first century. Josephus was a learned young man. We know about him, by the way, because he wrote an autobiography. So unfortunately, almost everything we know about Josephus, we know because Josephus told us so. So you have to take it. Yeah, there's always like a little bit of a concern about how truthful he's being. But nevertheless, he was a young man, a Kohen, who was of the aristocracy as well. He was sent, for example, to Rome as a young man in his 20s on a delegation from Israel, and he fell in love with Rome. He thought Rome was just an amazing place with all kinds of culture and so on. When he came back to the land of Israel, it was ready for revolt. And in fact, revolt broke out in the year 66. He ended up commanding the northern forces in the Galilee. And after what he tells us was brilliant generalship on his part, he was ultimately surrounded by Roman troops, put under siege for 47 days, and in a dramatic suicide pact that didn't work out, he ended up personally surrendering to the Romans. And then he ended up serving as their expert on everything Jewish. In other words, he actually turned coat, he changed sides, he became a traitor to the Jews and served the Romans, in particular Titus, the one who destroyed the temple, and gave them guidance on the land of Israel, on the Jewish people, and why they were so weird. And he becomes a problematic person for us to get data from, but there's no one else who gives us anything like the depth of data he provides about the first century. Now, why we're specifically looking at Josephus for now is because in his writings, the first major book he wrote was called The Roman-Jewish War, and he wrote about it firsthand. And then later he wrote a large book called The Jewish Antiquities. He has a passage that apparently is about Jesus. And it's a really important one. It's called the Testimonium Flavianum. The name of the paragraph is the Testimonium Flavianum. It's so called because he was adopted by the Roman emperor from the Flavian dynasty. So, and he took that as his last name. So his real name is Flavius Josephus. So in this passage, it reads like this. Oops, sorry, I just jumped to the wrong screen. And I lost where I was. You were like so excited. What was this going to say? What? There it is. There we go. You can see the little the paragraph here. I hope that's. Please, someone nod so I can see a nod or a thumbs up. Okay, I'm going to trust you can see it. So here we go. Here's the passage. Josephus writes, "About this time there lived Jesus, a wise man, if indeed one ought to call him a man," and this I put in bold for specific reasons, For he was the one who performed surprising deeds and was a teacher of such people as accept the truth gladly. He won over many Jews and many of the Greeks. He was the Messiah. And then there's more details here. Now, this is a paragraph that undoubtedly ensured Josephus's survival, because when Christians read this, they said, amazing, look at this. Here's someone who knows about Jesus, who was not a Christian. He's not reporting from the inside, and he's confirming everything we believed. This is it. This is the whole enchilada. We got to stay with this. And so that meant that Josephus from the ancient period was copied over and over again, lots of manuscripts circulating. Everybody wanted to read Josephus, and it ensured his survival. The only problem is most historians feel that this paragraph is a forgery, and that let's just consider how this text was created, right? We have no manuscripts of Josephus before the 4th century. We only have like later citations. Nobody has like an autographed copy of these books. So at some point between Josephus's death around the year 98 and the first time it's quoted by a church historian named Eusebius at the beginning of the 400s, we don't know what happened to the actual words in Josephus. And most historians believe that this paragraph in its entirety, or at least the bold sections, were copied in there by a very enthusiastic, over-enthusiastic Christian copyist. Meaning he's writing out Josephus and he's thinking to himself, oh, come on, this guy lives right there. He was in Jerusalem. He must have heard about Jesus. Certainly he would say something. And then the argument is that he actually, the copyist inserted it because out of his piety, he wanted to make sure that people would read about it. Because if you just think about it for a second, you know, if you're a Jewish person and you know what Mashiach means in Judaism, and you're writing and you say, yeah, he was Mashiach. And then you just go on with the rest of your life and the rest of your book, and nothing else happens. It's kind of like if I were to be talking to you right now and I would say that, and by the way, yesterday, aliens landed just outside my home and they took me captive, and I visited the planet Pluto, and I was there for 10 years, and they brought me back in a time warp, and I'm glad I can make this meeting. You know, you would think I was crazy. You would, how could I go on with my life normally? So most scholars believe that this passage is not actually in Josephus, or at least not the highlighted passages. It could be that he refers to Jesus because he does do kind of like an overview of what's going on intellectually in Israel at that time, but he doesn't say much more of detail about him at all. Over 20 volumes of written work. So that's the situation in terms of the environment. At this point, I've finished the first section of my my 3-part lecture, and I'm thinking that given the time, Rabbi, if I can see you there, I'm going to suggest that we stick to your plan then, and I'll go straight through with the other 2 sections. Okay, very good. So let me go to the second section here. So the first section was to kind of put Jesus in his political, historical environment. I would like now to look a little bit at his life specifically, his teachings, and his death. So these are all important for Jewish purposes. By way of preface, excuse me, I'm just going to take a drink. Someone told me that in Palm Beach, everyone likes to drink scotch, so I got myself a big glass. It's joking. It's actually diet ginger ale. The historical Jesus. So this is kind of an interesting sort of segue. Everybody has been searching for the historical Jesus for centuries. People have tried to go through the very, very few historical texts we have to know who exactly was this man. I mean, if you bracket aside the Christian scriptures, which obviously have their own story to tell and their own message they want to get across, what else do we know about him? Not too much. None other than Thomas Jefferson, the founding father, tried to do this, and he wrote his own book. As you can see, this is actually in his own hand, The Life and Morals of Jesus in Nazareth, extracted textually from the Gospels. This is called the Jefferson Bible from 1820, and what he literally did, and kids, please don't try this at home, you will get people upset. He took a razor and some glue, and he read through all the Christian scriptures and sliced out the things he didn't think were correct. He says, no, that doesn't make sense. He wouldn't have said it. It contradicts something else. It contradicts this. He razored out all those pieces, and when necessary, he rearranged them to write a whole new biography of Jesus. And it's kind of a quixotic attempt, but we're trying to do the same thing right now with what we have. So what are our sources? How can we reconstruct his life? We have obviously the Christian scriptures. Besides the fact that they have kind of like a tendency that they want to sell a particular message, they're quite late. The earliest of the scriptures are the letters of Paul, which were written at the earliest, a decade after Jesus was dead. So, they have limited value that way. We also have Josephus that has 2 mentions in total about Jesus. I've already shown you the really juicy one. The other one has even less information. We have Roman historian Tacitus, not a big friend of the Jews, who does happen to mention in passing the idea of Jesus, and more specifically, the Christian community. And we have some fascinating non-canonical texts. These are texts that are about Jesus and about Jesus's Mishpacha, but they did not make the cut into the Christian Bible for a lot of really interesting reasons. Like, for example, what exactly was the marital status of Mary, and what was her relationship to Joseph, right? The sort of adoptive father of Jesus. A lot of really interesting and controversial questions. So these ancient texts were found in Egypt a while ago, and they say interesting things that sort of like, we know the Christians rejected these texts. We, by the way, have the same thing in Judaism too. We have a whole bunch of books called Sfarim Chitzoniyim, outside texts that were not included in Tanakh. We still read them, we still refer to them, like Ben Sira is mentioned in the Talmud frequently, the book of the Maccabees, which gives us tremendous detail. Neither of these books made it into Tanakh, but we still had use for them. So it's not an unknown phenomenon. And then we have the church fathers, who are the leaders of the church over the next few hundred years. And again, they're writing at a distance of centuries, so it's limited historical value, but it's worth something. And finally, the Talmud, which is also written at a distance of centuries, although based on oral traditions, and also with an agenda. The Talmud has its own message it wants to give as well. So what happens when we put all of these sources into the blender, like Thomas Jefferson did? What can we get as a consensus about Jesus? We can say the following things. This is basically what scholars agree on. It's not a lot. We can agree that it's most likely he was a historical personage. He did exist. He was born probably sometime between the year 6 and 4 before the Common Era. He grew up in Nazareth. Note that I didn't say he was born in Bethlehem, because there's a real problem about whether or not he was actually born in Bethlehem. He was baptized by a figure named John the Baptist, who's very significant and was apparently his senior in many ways at that time. And then he spent most of his adult life debating and teaching religion and morality with other Jews. Almost everybody he talks to is Jewish. There are a couple of moments where he goes outside of Israel proper to Sidon and to Tyre and what would be today Lebanon. And he has some interesting parables about Samaritans and things like that. But the vast majority of his interlocutors are fellow Jews. He was ultimately crucified by Roman forces under Pontius Pilate sometime between the years 26 and 36. That's basically all we really know. What do we not know? Well, I can put it into 3 big areas for our purposes. What we don't know is, what was his relationship to Torah and Judaism, right? We'd like to know, was he there to rebel against the Torah? Was he there to uphold the Torah? What was it? How did he deal with the rabbis? How did he deal with the Sadducees? Things like that. What was his relationship to the many political ideologies of the day? I mentioned the rabbis, who are known as the Pharisees in Christian scriptures. They're essentially like, the people in Pirkei Avos, Rabbi Akiva, Hillel, Shammai, but we also have the Tzdukim, the Sadducees, who opposed the rabbis, who were in favor of capitulating to Rome. And we have the Zealots, who wanted to fight against Rome no matter what, regardless of the cost. They wanted to fight against Rome, and they were willing to fight other Jews who disagreed with them and assassinate them. How did Jesus feel about these people? What was his position politically? And then finally, how did he deal with the significant number of non-Jews who were living in the area? How did he feel about what was he teaching for Jews only, or was it for the whole world? What was his thinking in this area? So let's see if we can sort of scope out the parameters of the debate on those three areas. Let us recall that there are a few things we have to bear in mind whenever we look at this. First of all, we have to think about, who is the audience? Most of the Christian scriptures, which are the main source we have for trying to understand Jesus' teachings, they are reaching out to non-Jews, and almost all of them are reaching out to, when I say, I shouldn't say non-Jews, I should say people who are ethnically not Jewish. To Corinthians, to Greeks, to Romans, to all kinds of people like that. There are a few sections of the New Testament that are specifically speaking to Hebrews, and most of Jesus's own conversations are with Hebrews, but with the context of the writings are realizing that the real customers are in the non-Jewish world, the Gentile world. Secondly, we should realize that the teachings were not offered in the original language. Jesus most likely spoke Aramaic, which is a language very closely related to Hebrew. And he may have spoken some koine, which is kind of like a basic level of Greek that was well circulating in the Eastern Mediterranean. But the translation was all into Greek. So as soon as you move from a Semitic language, and especially a God-soaked language like Hebrew, and you translate that into a secular language like Greek, you lose vocabulary, you lose ways of saying anything. Like, for example, Jews understand the concept of a prophet. They understand the concept of a person who gets a message from God. Go tell people they've got to shape up, they've got to do tshuva, or they'll be destroyed, right? Like Yonah being told to go to Nineveh and tell people to do tshuva. That doesn't really work in a Greek context. The gods generally don't care what people do in a Greek context. And so someone running around saying, hey, the God wants us to do this or that, they'd be saying, what? Why would he want that? What they do understand, though, is kind of like the holy man, the person who separates from society, contemplates the infinite, right? Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, those are kind of like holy people in Greek context. So just trying to shift the prophet image into the holy man image in Greek right away loses a lot of value because you can't explain it. If I can give you a different example, observant Jews have a very common Yiddish word, Shabbosdik, right? What does Shabbosdik mean? It means Sabbath-like. So I can say in English the word Sabbath-like, but if you don't know what Shabbos is, you don't know what the word means. What do you mean by Sabbath-like? Does that mean you wear nicer clothes? Yeah, it does mean that, but it also means that you relax, you don't check your email, that you spend time with your family, your friends, you sing, you recharge, So just the word itself conveys a whole body of meaning that translation will not carry. And finally, the authorship. Who's writing these texts, Jesus' teachings, in someone else's words? And what is he trying to sell? What is his agenda? As we shall see, Paul in particular is very important. So in those three areas that I identified in the previous slide, when it comes to Torah and Judaism, on the one hand, we clearly see that the rabbis who are occasionally arguing with Jesus are trying to figure out how frum he is. And for example, in one particular section in the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it's repeated a couple times there, they really take him to task saying, is it true that you and your followers don't wash before you eat? Don't wash your hands before you eat. Now, I have to say, I feel really sorry for Christians who are reading this, because if they don't have any idea about Netilas Yadayim, about the laws of ritually washing your hands before you eat bread, they'll be thinking about this saying, what? Is Jesus and his followers, are they like unhygienic? Everybody washes their hand before they eat. What are they talking about? And yet this discussion in the New Testament gets very, very heated. And the reason why they're asking them that is because it's not about whether or not you're clean before eating. It's whether or not you're paying attention to the rabbis. The rabbis made a mitzvah that you must wash netilas yadayim before eating. And if you're not washing netilas yadayim, you're not paying attention to rabbinic law. They're trying to place him on the spectrum of how frum he is. Similar issues with healing on Shabbat. So it looks like they're testing him to see, it looks like you're not behaving like a frum yid, but on the other hand, he says things like, I have come not to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. By the way, the word the law is another example. There's no word for Torah in Greek, so they have to say the law. And to say the Torah is only the law, and it's not the spirit, and it's not the ethics, and it's not the stories, and it's not the history, you're right away, narrowing your definition of what Torah is. So where is he holding this? We see that there's a range of expressions. It's hard to pin him down to any of this. Another example in political ideologies, in some cases, he seems to be very much like the rabbis, in which he says, for example, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. In other words, pay your taxes, don't make trouble, don't argue, don't try to fight, right? The rabbis were generally pacifistic. They did not want to try and fight the Romans. They were not happy with the Sadducees in charge of the temple, but they certainly did not want violence, especially not in the 40s. That would change a little bit in the 60s. But on the other hand, he causes a huge ruckus in the temple by overturning the money changers' tables and things like that. And he calls the people who are working in the Beis HaMikdash a den of robbers, right? So that's much more like a zealot. Where is he holding politically? Hard to say based on what we have in the Gospels. And on Jews and Gentiles, this is perhaps the most important. Was Jesus essentially like one of the rabbis who was perhaps a little bit more outre, a little bit more out there because he was known for hanging around with people who were like on the fringes of society? Like he would have been in the homeless shelters. He would have been like helping out prostitutes. This is really, he had a large following from kind of like people at the very fringes of society, but he was still teaching Judaism. Or was he trying to teach something different? Trying to teach a universal kind of ethic that applied to everybody, non-Jews as well. In other words, was he trying to teach Judaism plus, or was he saying, no, I'm not teaching Judaism at all. I'm teaching something for Greeks, which are totally different. And we see this in the book of Galatians in the Christian scriptures, in which James appears to be in charge of one type of gospel, the gospel to the circumcised, meaning keep kosher, keep Shabbos if you're Jewish. And Paul, the gospel to the uncircumcised, meaning a totally different thing. That does not necessarily mean you have to keep kosher and so on. Let us not forget that Judaism at this time is a very competitive ideology. A lot of Romans are converting to Judaism because they see, wow, life after death, personal God who listens to your prayer. Who ever heard of that? That's amazing. I love that. What do I have to do to be part of this religion? Oh, circumcision? Well, I have to restrict my diet, no more pork. Oh my gosh, and take off one day a week? Seriously? I work so hard. So many Romans were kind of like fellow travelers rather than really diving into Judaism. They love the ideas of it, but the practices, it's a high threshold, a high bar to reach to join the community. But Christianity offered the benefits of the ideas of Judaism without the huge personal, social, and lifestyle cost that it would take to become a Yid. And so this is a big question that will be especially significant in the era of Paul. Now, let us conclude this second part by looking at the Passion, which is his death. And in some ways, his death, we hope, can reflect a little bit on his life and help us understand. If we know why he was killed, maybe we can understand what he was teaching and how he fits in with the rest of the Jewish community. So before we begin, we should recall that in traditional Christian theology, and this is one thing, by the way, that I got from my own teacher in this area, Alan Davies, who was a minister in the University of Toronto, that basic Christian theology, now why is this jumping ahead so quickly? Sorry, I'll have to jump back, was that quote unquote, Christ died for our sins, meaning the whole point of his death within Christian theology is that he was like the sacrificial lamb for all of us. And to say this particular people murdered him and they're to blame completely wipes out from the very foundation Christian theology. The whole idea is, for God so loved the world, he sent his only begotten son, etc., that it was for everybody, for the entire world. To say that we are saved and those bad Jews, they deserve to die because they did this to our God, that's paganism. It's not Christianity. Here on the left, you see a remarkable piece of art from Marc Chagall, La Crucifixion Blanche, the white crucifixion, painted in 1938. I don't have to point out to you why that's such an important year, just before the Holocaust. And he's clearly portrayed Jesus as a Jew. And in this painting, he highlights everything that has come from this dark moment in the 30s of the first century. He shows here a person in a San Benito from the Spanish Inquisition, a person running away with the Sefer Torah, Torah's on fire and women crying, refugees, this is around the era of the St. Louis, burning buildings, pogromists coming over the hillside, and people, the burning synagogues. Here's a person, it looks like he's wearing an armband. I wonder if he's thinking of the brown shirts in Nazi era. And above Jesus's head are these angelic beings, and they're all clearly distressed. They look like they might be Jesus's ancestors saying, is this what we intended? Not at all. This is not right. So there's no question that a lot of terrible things have come out of the Passion, which is what this period is called. Now, there's the passage. And the church has come around to this. By the time we get to the 1960s, the Catholic Church publishes a new encyclical of teachings called Nostra Aetate, which means our state, in which they clearly say the Jews are not to blame. Okay, it's 2,000 years later. Yasher Koach, I'm glad that they could say that, but a lot of pain has happened in 2 millennia. We have had to deal with the charge of deicide, this bizarre idea that somehow we killed God. That's what the term means, dei from God, right? Deicide. And what does that actually mean? Now, going back to where we left off, though, why was Jesus killed? It's very clear when you read the description of the trial, it's very ahistorical. It doesn't make any sense by any judicial means, either in Jewish law. There's no Sanhedrin, there's no Hasra, there's no discussion like you would normally have, no witness testimony. And on the Roman side, it's just a purely capricious desire on the part of Pontius Pilate, which he certainly could do. They were no stranger to crucifixion. Life was cheap at that time, especially Jewish life. But there's no way to say that he had a fair trial in any means. And it's hard to say that that trial represented anything of reality. Was he killed because of blasphemy? Clearly not. It's not brought forward even in the text that we have. Was he killed because of political rebellion? Possibly, although it's interesting to note that only he was killed and not his followers. If it was really a political rebellion, you would assume that it would involve more people. Here, by the way, you see a political element. According to the Gospels, on the top of his cross, the Romans scratched in the letters INRI, which stands for Jesus Nostri Rex Judeorum, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews, which was meant to be a mockery. They put a crown of thorns around his head, which Chagall has chosen not to represent. And just to make sure we understood the Jewish element of this, he puts in Aramaic, Yoshu HaNotzri Malka Diudai, right? Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. What has followed the Jews around is something called the blood cry. This is a very difficult phenomenon. In the passage of the Passion, Pontius Pilate says at one point to the gathered Jews, and this is, Pesach, and he says to them, I'm prepared to let one prisoner go free. Would you like me to let this Jesus go free or this Barabbas? And in the account of the Gospels, they say, let Barabbas go free. And he says, are you sure? And they say this passage, his blood be on us and on our children. This notorious verse has been used by anti-Semites for centuries in sermonizing why the Jews deserve to die centuries and centuries after this event. Although the original author of this passage was probably referring to the very next generation, which would have suffered the destruction of the temple, and perhaps was writing it kind of like referring to that generation, saying, look what happened to them because of Jesus. that itself is bad enough, but unfortunately it has been twisted over the centuries to mean much, much more. Now with that, let me quickly turn to the last period, and this will just take, I think, about 5 minutes, and then we can stop and go straight to questions. I just have to find unshare. Here it is. Stop share. How did the synagogue and the church separate after all of this? So this is where we have to turn specifically to, hang on, I don't think I'm sharing the right thing. 29, here we go. There we are. We have to turn a little bit more to Paul in particular. So Paul, as I mentioned earlier, was definitely Jesus's most important disciple, who actually is probably more responsible for Christianity than Jesus was himself. He never actually met Paul. He never actually met Jesus in real life. He was a Jew from Asia Minor by the name of Shaul. He later was known by Paul. But he met Jesus after Jesus died as a resurrected Jesus on the road to Damascus. Here's an amazing 16th century rendition of it. There's like the risen Jesus, very dramatic, the heavenly host, things like that. And here is Paul, who describes himself as being like knocked senseless and blinded for several days because he was overwhelmed by the experience. What I especially like about this particular piece of art is that the horse takes up the center of the perspective and is the most aggressively gripping part of the entire frame. But at any rate, Paul takes the message that he gets from Jesus, and again, never met him in real life, and he goes on a whirlwind tour throughout the Eastern Mediterranean, going to the Italian peninsula, the Greek peninsula, Asia Minor. Everywhere he goes, he is talking about Jesus, and people love it. People say, this is great. This is everything I loved about Judaism without the high cost of becoming observant. And so Jesus, his message extends very, very deeply in the next few decades through Paul in particular. It also creates, however, an anti-Semitic backlash in what's called the Adversus Judaeos literary tradition. Adversus Judaeos means against the Jews, because if on the one hand, you want to spend a lot of time talking about how great Christianity is, lifting it up with your right hand, then people will say, well, what's the difference between you and Judaism? You have to push down Judaism with the left hand. So there's built in a kind of like why we are so much better than our predecessors. You see this especially in church art, which proceeds throughout the Middle Ages. These are a few Gothic examples where the synagogue and church are usually portrayed as two women. Here you see some monumental architecture in a church in Strasbourg. On the left is always the church with an upright staff and a crown. And on the right is the synagogue with a broken staff, blindfolded to the truth. In her left hand, her weak hand, she's losing hold of the 10 Commandments, and she's literally in an act of decline. She's falling from the rock. There are literally hundreds of examples of this. This is from Notre Dame before the fire. On the left, you see the church with, clear-eyed and crowned and so on. And on the right, synagogue, broken staff, blindfolded by a snake, right? Very clear reference to the serpent of Genesis. Here's an even more powerful one, a stained glass window in Verben, Germany, 14th century. On the right, a hand descends from heaven and crowns the church. On the right, a sword descends from heaven and pierces the synagogue through the top of her skull. Very clear statement of disfavor. And that's kind of like what happens to this separation, because as the church expands and speaks more and more to Gentiles and explains how we are like better than Judaism, we have advanced past Judaism, those Jews are bad, come to us, that changes the entire dynamic of the two faiths. Now, on the other hand, the Jews are not sitting by the sideline either. In Israel, we still have this confusing population of Jewish Christians who are ethnically Jewish, who are still following James's understanding of a gospel to the circumcised, that they say that what they're doing is Judaism plus, and they want to keep going to shul and keep believing in Jesus. They believe that there's no contradiction. And so the rabbis, they set a line in the sand. They asked Shmuel HaKatan, this is recorded in the Talmud Tractate Brachot, Daf Chav Ches. They asked Shmuel HaKatan, can you please compose a blessing for the heretics? And it's not really a blessing, it's actually a curse. And this blessing was inserted into the daily prayers. And whenever at least how scholars believe this was used originally, whenever someone was suspected of having secret Christian beliefs, still keeping kosher, still going to shul, still paying day school tuition, they would say, hey, listen, Shlomi, why don't you lead the davening? He would go up to the Amud, who would begin to daven. And when he got to this particular passage, if he read it out loud, he's essentially cursing the heretics. He uses the word informers, but that's euphemistic. Then that would essentially be saying, I'm with the Jews. I'm not with them. And on the other hand, if he refused, then he could literally be removed from the podium and removed from the synagogue and removed from the community. There are some scholars who believe that John, the author of the Gospel according to John, actually suffered this particular fate. So the separation was not only in the church, going to become more Gentile, it was also the synagogue saying, Ad Kan, these are the boundaries of what is Judaism and what is not. Finally, we should understand that by the 4th century, when Constantine, shown here, has this famous vision of a cross, and on it says, "In hoc signo vinces," and this signal, on this sign you will conquer, and he decides to convert to Christianity. That makes Christianity, at the beginning of the 4th century, formally a state religion. And everything changes. The dynamic is so different. The Jews have been exiled from their land now for 200 odd years. They are vastly outnumbered by the Christians, who now control the reins of power and the economy and so on. And the imbalance between these two groups has changed the entire dynamic so much. And that's essentially the galus that has continued to the present day. With that, I'm going to conclude. I thank you very much for your endurance. I know I spoke a little bit longer than we had intended, but I'm really very happy to take some questions, and I hope you found this useful intellectual stimulation.
Thank you, Dr. Abramson. That was absolutely fascinating, and we appreciate you sharing all this knowledge with us. If anyone has questions, please type them into the chat box. Dr. Abramson, one of the questions that has already been posted was, does Mary come as a descendant from the line of Joseph rather than Judah, which would make him ineligible to be a Jewish king?
I'm not such an expert in Christian theology that I would know specifically. This sounds like something that if you're wondering about ineligible to be a Jewish king, I would think the first thing you got to do is identify the father, right? Because the kingship goes from the Shevet goes through the father's line, not the mother's line. And then you have the question of, well, what is the Immaculate Conception? If you want to say that Joseph was from Yehuda, I suppose that would be half an answer. And if you want to say there was an Immaculate Conception and that Jesus was sort of like the Son of God in a literal sense, well, do we really care about lineage if he's the Son of God in a literal sense? It's kind of like saying, I have $100 in my wallet, but I have $1,000 in my bank account. So why do I worry about the $100 in my wallet?
Right.
I'm not sure how to answer that question. I apologize.
Okay, no problem. Somebody's asking something more about Judaism than Christianity here. Someone posed the question that you mentioned resurrection, that was very appealing to Gentiles, this idea that Judaism believes in. And someone's actually asking the question, which I'll let you answer, which is, does Judaism believe in resurrection?
Well, that's a great question. And the simple answer is yes. The more complicated answer is it depends on who you ask, because there's no question that in the time of Jesus, there were many different sects of Judaism, not all of whom agreed about resurrection. And furthermore, do we mean a physical bodily resurrection, or do we mean some kind of spiritual, soul-only resurrection? So there's a whole spectrum of beliefs in the first century regarding that. There's no question, though, that Rabbinic Judaism definitely believes in both. a spiritual resurrection followed by a physical resurrection. And that's the group that Jesus would have been closest to, the so-called Pharisees.
Okay. What is the Talmudic account? Is there a famous Talmudic account about what drove Jesus to leave the traditional Jewish path?
Yeah, there are many actually, and they're not entirely consistent with one another, which is typical for the Talmud. I mean, the Talmud is a very rich, complex document with many different, layers and textures of meaning. The passage that I think the questioner is probably referring to is Gemara Sota Daf Mem, if I remember correctly. It's a passage that was expunged from many Talmuds because the church insisted on removing it, and only in the late 20th century, if you have a Steinsaltz Gemara, you'll find it in there. If you have manuscripts that were amended by the Yemenites, you'll see it there as well. Fascinating story, I would like to tell you. It goes like this, and there's a problem with it because it can't chronologically fit with what we know about Jesus's dates, but let's set that aside for a minute. The Gemara says that his teacher was a man named Rabbi Yeshua ben Prachia, who incidentally was censured by the rabbis for not being a very effective educator. The Talmud says that when you're a good educator, you have to draw people, your students, close with your right hand, but at the same time push them away with your left hand. Your right hand is stronger. It means you make them feel like you care about them, you bring them in, but bringing them in too close, you can get arrested for things like that, right? You have to push them away, maintain a little bit of professional distance as well. And that's kind of a dynamic. Not, says the Talmud, like Jesus's teacher, who pushed him away with both hands. What was the story? They were in Egypt during the reign of Alexander Yanai, who was one of the last of the Maccabean kings. And when Alexander Yanai died and his wife, Shlomtzion Amalka, who was a good queen, came to power, she invited all the rabbis back. She said, it's safe, not going to kill you guys, like my husband who crucified so many of you. And so Jesus and his teacher, Rabbi Yeshua ben Prachia, are on the way back to Israel. They stop at an inn, presumably in the Sinai or maybe the Negev, something like that. And they're served by a really gracious and hospitable innkeeper, a woman. And the teacher says to the student, Jesus, what a nice woman. And he says in Hebrew, kama na'a isha zo, how nice is this woman? Now, in Hebrew, the word na'a can mean nice, like, pleasant, kind, or it can mean beautiful. The teacher clearly intended to mean, look, she's sweet. Look how nice she is. Look how nicely she treated us. Jesus thought he meant how beautiful she was. And he said to his teacher, well, Taka, her eyes are a little round, as if to say, she could lose a few pounds, something like that. His teacher got so mad at him. He said, Rasha, you wicked person. That's what you're thinking about? You think me, your Rebbe, is thinking about what she looks like? I was talking about her personality. The Talmud says he brings out 400 shofars and puts them in cherem, excommunicates them. Rashi says that's a guzma, it's an exaggeration, but it means he really gave it to him. And then Jesus keeps coming back, he keeps asking for forgiveness. The rabbi puts him off. Finally, the rabbi decides, okay, Jesus has had enough. I'm going to forgive him now. But the problem is that when Jesus came, he was saying the Shema prayer, couldn't interrupt it. So he held up his hand like this, as if to say, wait a second, rega, because I just got to finish the Shema. But Jesus thought, that's it. He's rejected me again. I'm going to start my own religion. And that's the Talmud's version. Now, I think it's a beautiful story because what it really gets to is the idea that, Judaism and Christianity, they were really so close at the very beginning. Some missteps, perhaps, some miscommunications, who knows what, but just that one little breaking point caused them to split off and just get worse and worse and worse. And the Musar from the Talmud itself is, don't be like the Rebbe. It doesn't blame Jesus. It blames the Rebbe for not holding that student close. And it's a fascinating passage. Sorry for the long-winded answer.
No, that's fascinating, actually. How a simple mistake could lead to such grave consequences, which have caused so much suffering and persecution of the Jews over the millenniums. If Jesus was to come back to life today and see how much persecution of the Jews was carried out in his name, what would he say about that? That's number one. Number two, what was his level of observance at the time of his death? Was he putting on tefillin every morning? Was he keeping Shabbos? Or did he start changing? I mean, you mentioned some of the things that they questioned if he did in the Tilas Yadayim, which you may say is a minor thing. But what about the major things like Shabbos, kosher, tefillin, tzitzis, all of these things? Was he doing these things? Or had he evolved, so to speak, in his Judaism as well?
Oh, those are two good questions. I think the first one, Chagall answered, I think, far better than I can, especially with time being short and a picture worth 1,000 words. But I think that white crucifixion really encompasses the idea of, and Jesus would say, what are they doing in my name, so to speak? Can't even contemplate how awful that is. As to the other question, which is really a very germane question to our topic tonight, there's no red flag that says absolutely here he is doing something that's puzzle. And by the way, washing Natilas Yadayim in that context, it was not a minor thing. If you went to shul and if you were in a smicha exam and you said to the rabbi, I've decided not to do this one mitzvah, I hope that's okay, I got another 612 that are down, you're not going to make it, right? You have to accept to do all 613, even though people understand that you're going to mess up with them, but you can't say, this one I'm not going to consider. That would not get you in the rabbi club. What he does, though, is he's he's a disruptive figure. And for example, on the discussion of healing on the Sabbath, where the rabbis are saying to him, is it true that you are practicing healing on the Sabbath? In that context, it was refuah, like with spiritual means, like driving out spirits and things like that, which happens a lot in the New Testament. And technically speaking, there is a prohibition on healing on the Sabbath, but it's basically derived from, as the rabbi knows, the prohibition of grinding medicines, right? Which would be an Isser Malacha of Shabbos. So he would famously say things like, was not the Sabbath made for the man and not man made for the Sabbath? So it's not like he's saying, I'm violating Shabbos. He's saying to people, you have to get things in priority. You have to put things in perspective. There are definitely associations of his students doing things and whether or not he chose to rebuke them on what they did on Shabbos. But he himself, we don't have any kind of red flag. He's clearly violating a rabbinic or a Torah law, which is one of those things that makes him very difficult to interpret. He definitely had chutzpah, and he was not afraid to criticize his elders. And he, some would say in a positive sense, he spoke truth to power. Others would say that he was disrespectful, but we don't have a clear indication of him breaking halacha. So it's hard to pin him down one way or the other.
Was the last Seder was the Last Supper a Seder meal?
Yeah, it's believed to be a Seder meal.
What do you attribute the change in attitude of the church towards Jews in our generation, and how do you view that relationship today? In other words, we have now Jews for Jews for Jesus and things like that. There is some effort on behalf of the church to try to convert us to Christianity, as opposed to, try to kill us. Do you see this as a blessing, this change of attitude, and what are the pitfalls or the dangers that still exist today?
Oh, absolutely. So The Jews for Jesus and the conversion of the Jews, that's certainly nothing old. That goes all the way back to Paul, because converting a Jew to Christianity is considered like a very significant achievement. And, I've been the victim of quite a bit of those efforts myself on the internet and other places. But so that's certainly nothing new. What you do see new, however, like with Nostra Aetate that we referred to earlier, Vatican II, after the Holocaust, there is a massive wake-up moment for the organized church saying, seriously, is this what we have been teaching? This is not the actions of the Prince of Peace. And I think, I'm not sure that pertains to the same degree at all in 2020 as it did in the 1960s. The honeymoon is definitely ending. The other thing that's changed a lot is also the establishment of the state of Israel, because for millennia, part of the reason that the Jews were allowed to live in medieval Europe and early modern Europe is because in our downtrodden state, we served as a witness to what happens, so to speak, if you reject the founder of Christianity. But if the state of Israel achieves statehood and they're suddenly ascendant and powerful, how does that change traditional theology? For the Catholics, it has been a really difficult thing, and you see many popes struggle with how to recognize the state of Israel. For born-again Christians, on the other hand, they say, oh, wait a minute, this must mean that we really are about to have the Messianic era, and that they champion the state of Israel. They're actually bigger fans of Israel than many Jews are. So it's a complicated moment that we're living in that way.
Right. Regarding the subject of Jesus being the Messiah, what does Maimonides say that this was introduced to the world for an ultimate goal and purpose?
I am unaware of that. I am familiar with some teachings of Maimonides that speaks about, the idea of monotheism and the idea that a slightly reduced monotheism might be appropriate for non-Jews, such as, for example, in Islam, and that the idea in Christianity of shituf, of Trinity, might be acceptable for non-Jews, but not necessarily for Jews. But I can't claim any expertise to know what my
Did he say about himself that he was the Messiah?
Not clearly at all. He tended to fudge that statement significantly. He would say, I am the Son of Man.
So Josephus calls him a Messiah.
The Testimonium Flavianum says he's the Messiah. It's a big question whether or not Josephus actually said that. If he said it, it's so incredible. How could he possibly not, expand on that statement? It's like if I were to say,
Right.
My parents were alligators, and then not explain what I mean by that.
Right. Do you feel comfortable talking a little bit about the tradition that, I don't know if it's your tradition or some Jews have a tradition about not studying Torah called Nittelnacht on the night of the 25th? And also at the same time, is there a discussion whether this is really his birthday or whether it was deliberately chosen to compete with Hanukkah on the 25th of Kislev, so the 25th of December became a secular holiday or a religious holiday for them to draw Jews away from Hanukkah?
So that's an interesting suggestion. I believe that I'm not an expert on this at all, but I seem to recall reading that his birthday is most likely in the spring, and I don't remember why. It's probably some concatenation of verses in the Gospels. But the December 25th is usually right around the winter solstice. And although Hanukkah is sometimes around here, it's always the time of the Roman orgies. And this is a great time to sort of draw Christians away from the Roman parties. I would mention, though, in context, something that I do know a little more about is that we should recall for the first 300 years of the existence of Christianity, one of the biggest challenges was trying to define for themselves how they differed from Judaism, because Christianity did not have a long, rich tradition of rituals, of holidays, of performances. And how do you structure a religion around no calendar and no activities and no, so a lot of those first 300 years were spent trying to figure out separation points. In the Council of Nicaea, for example, in the year 325, they decided once and for all, Shabbos is now on Sunday, right? They moved it from Saturday to Sunday because it was too confusing for Christians. Aren't we supposed to go to shul today? What's going on? No, Sunday. And they also separated Passover from Easter. Otherwise, Easter always would have occurred on Passover. So they switched it away from the Hebrew calendar.
Wow. And do you want to talk about Nittelnacht?
Oh, yeah, right. I'm not that familiar with a lot of the writings on this. It's more of a Hasidish custom than a Lithuanian one. And I'm a Litvak. You can tell by my, stunning good looks and fashion sense. The Litvaks don't hold with the idea that there should be any night that you dafka take off from learning Torah. And so the idea of Nittelnacht doesn't make sense to them. I believe that the origins of the Hasidic custom is more to say that this night is so unimportant to us that we're just going to play cards. I'm not sure, but I think I heard some reason like that at one point.
Okay, last question, because we could go on all night, Dr. Abramson, and we really thank you for this very broad and excellent presentation. But a lot of people are looking forward to turning the calendar on January 1st to 2021 and say good riddance 2020. But how should we as Jews feel about the fact that the calendar we use is based on the birth of Jesus? Is that connecting us to this Christianity and affirming some kind of a belief?
Well, I think that's a very sophisticated question. It's a little bit outside my purview as a historian, but I'm happy to share with you my thoughts as a regular person, if you don't mind. It's a little bit, I think, like when you're driving and you happen to glance down at the odometer and it's 99999. You say, oh my gosh, look at that. My odometer is about to roll over to 100,000. And you feels like a simcha, feels like something happened, right? When in reality, it's just the wheels turning on the odometer, and there's no lights and no Y2K and no lightning bolts or anything like that. And I think to a large degree, that's how we're measuring time. The ironic thing is that the various calendars that Jews have used, and we have used many different calendars in our long history, are entirely for convenience sake, other than the actual calendar that we use for Moadim, like the Hebrew calendar. For example, the first time that we as a people began to use a unified calendar was in the year 312 before the Common Era, when we adopted the calendar of the Seleucids, the Syrian Greeks, same people of the Hanukkah story. And that was the most popular calendar, and it was used by Sephardi Jews or Mizrahi Jews right up until about the year 1500. They were still good 312 years ahead of everyone else. Furthermore, there are Christian groups who are all on different calendars. The Julian calendar was used in the Russian Empire until the 20th century, which was 11 days behind. It was losing a day every century. So the fact that right now we're tied to whatever this is, December 21st, 2020, right? It's just an arbitrary number. And I don't think we should feel in any way energized about it, unless it helps propel us to some artificial self-imposed goal. Like you say, I'm going to lose so much weight in 2021. If that you can do, okay, fine. Otherwise, I don't see any reason to get all worked up about it. On the other hand, Jewish time does have phenomenal significance. The association with Pesach being the time of redemption, and Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, using it as your time for tshuva. These are very, very powerful markers, in my humble opinion.
Thank you very, very much, Dr. Henry Abramson. We really thoroughly enjoyed your presentation, and it's really an honor for us to have you because we've never had the pleasure of having you at the Palm Beach Synagogue. So we're one step closer now that we've had you on Zoom. And God willing, when this COVID pandemic is over, we extend a hearty invitation for you to come spend Shabbos with us in person so we can get to know you even better because we really enjoyed tonight's presentation. So thank you very much, and much continued success with the phenomenal work of Touro College, which is really one of the leading universities in the Jewish world today, serving such a vast number of Jewish students, from our executive director, Siraj Workin, to the tens of thousands or maybe even hundreds of thousands of students over the years. And kol hakavod, and continue from strength to strength. And thank you for your presentation this evening. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for joining us, and have a wonderful night. It was an outstanding presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was all
Thank
very
you
kind.
so much.
Much appreciated. Thank you.
Beautiful
Thank you.
presentation.